Thank you for joining us today. This is Eileen Schroff with the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center. I'm here with the next installment of our Human Services Transportation course. This is a topic that I'm sure many of you are eager to hear about, which is funding. We are lucky enough to have Amy Fong with the Federal Transit Administration to join us today, and she will help walk us through some federal funding resources, specifically the 5310 program. Before I introduce her, I do want to remind folks that we have some thought questions posted on our course platform for you to take a look at. I do encourage you, as you listen to Amy's presentation, to think about those questions and also the application of some of these programs in your own community. So Amy's going to walk us through federal funding resources, which in full transparency, I think can sometimes be a bit daunting, but the dollars that are available do offer so much support to communities to build programs to serve the needs of older adults and people with disabilities. And we're really lucky to have Amy here to help us understand the requirements, the qualifications, and the application of this money. So to give her a formal introduction, Amy Fong is a program analyst in the Federal Transit Administration's Rural and Target Programs Division in the Office of Program Management. This division oversees the Enhanced Mobility for Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities program, Section 5310, the Mobility for All pilot program, the Rural Area Formula Grants, Section 5311, the Tribal Transit Program, which is Section 5311C, and the Coordinated Council on Access and Mobility. The division also oversees 4 technical assistance centers: the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center, the National Center on Mobility Management, the National Rural Transit Assistance Program, and the National Center for Applied Transit Technology. So Amy, I will now turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction, Eileen. So like Eileen mentioned, I work on a team at FTA that oversees a really diverse array of grant programs and other initiatives. And so the programs that we fund cover such a diverse array of areas, such as mobility management, aging and disability transportation, all kinds of human service transportation, and rural and tribal transit. And this landscape is so diverse that our stakeholders range from small startup transit systems with a single person who is both the executive director, well, and the bus dispatcher and the grant writer all in one, to, like the very built out, mature, fixed route transit systems. So because there's such diversity in the types of programs that we support, many of our grant programs at FTA are designed to be state and locally driven, with a lot of flexibility for the designated state or regional recipient to determine how to manage FTA funds among subrecipients in a way that best reflects local and state conditions. And that's certainly true with the program that I'll focus my discussion on today, FTA's Section 5310 Enhanced Mobility for Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities program. So moving on to our learning objectives for today, like we said, I'll cover the federal funding perspective on this program, and I'll break that down into these 4 main learning objectives. So I'll begin by going over the mission and program requirements of our 5310 funding program, as FTA has interpreted the statute for this program. But in our second learning objective, I'll hone in on how at the local level you can access Section 5310 funding based on which state or urbanized area that you may be providing transportation in. In our third learning objective, I'll discuss what the range of local matches are allowable under FTA program requirements, with the important caveat that you certainly need to verify with your designated recipient what is allowable within that broader range of what's allowable by FTA. And then finally, in our fourth learning objective, I will discuss some federal initiatives that have taken place and are ongoing that were designed to increase the coordination and leveraging of multiple federal resources towards human service transportation. Within those initiatives, it's related to our third learning objective, and that a big way that coordination takes place is by using multiple sources of federal transportation funding within a single organization's funding strategy. Again, our first learning objective is an overview of the Section 5310 program from the federal perspective. The goal of this program is to improve mobility for seniors and individuals with disabilities throughout the country in a variety of ways, or through a variety of ways. And I'll go into those in more detail in a moment. And towards this goal, we not only do we provide financial assistance, but we also, like I mentioned, participate heavily in a variety of initiatives that support coordination with other federal programs and services. So to give you a sense of the funding levels that the Section 5310 program has seen in the past, so the way that federal transit programs are funded is they're authorized in transportation authorization bills that are passed by Congress and are typically in effect from at least 2 to 5 or perhaps even more years at a time. The most recent such bill was the FAST Act, which authorized federal transit funding programs from fiscal year 2016 to fiscal year 2020. Since I'm recording this in June 2020, we're closing in on the last few months of that FAST Act authorization, and we're all looking ahead to see what funding levels Congress will set in the future. But certainly past funding levels are a good indication of what the future might hold. So you can see that in the last 5 years, the formula authorization has increased from around 262 million to this year's 285 million. And at the same time, the FAST Act also introduced a discretionary pilot program, which FTA has administered under a few names, ranging from Rides to Wellness to Access and Mobility Partnership Grants to, in 2020, the Mobility for All pilot program. And again, that's another program that we'll see with the next authorization how or whether that'll be continued and in what form and what priorities that it'll hold. But going back to Section 5310, geographically the funding is distributed based on large urbanized areas, small urbanized areas, and rural or non-urbanized areas. So FTA basically defines a large urbanized area as one that's designated by the Census Bureau to have a population of larger than 200,000 people as of the 2010 decennial census. The definition of a small urbanized area is being an urbanized area that has between 50,000 to 200,000 people in population. And then finally, a rural area is one that's non-urbanized as designated by the Census Bureau. And I'll also note that in 2020, the Census Bureau is actively undertaking its next decennial census, and we would expect the new urbanized areas to be, or for the urbanized areas to be updated sometime around 2022 and to be incorporated in around the 2023 FTA formula programs for the first time. So it's definitely important to be aware of whether or not you're in an urbanized area and whether or not you're in a large or small urbanized area. Because the way that we distribute Section 5310 funding is that 60% of it goes to large urban, 20% to small urban, and 20% to rural. And the way that that statutory formula is written is the intent is to fund geographies on the basis of the ratio of seniors and individuals with disabilities in that area relative to all similarly sized geographies. So if your rural area has 5% of the count of seniors and individuals with disabilities in your area relative to all other rural areas, then you would receive 5% of that 20% of, for instance, in 2020, 285 million. So I'll discuss eligible 5310 projects from the FTA perspective, which is twofold. We kind of think of two types of 5310 projects, and we call them traditional 5310 and other 5310 projects. So first of all, we also have from the perspective of the direct recipient, they need to make sure that at least 55% of their area's apportionment is spent on traditional 5310 projects. And then on the other side of things, up to 45% can be spent on other 5310 projects or state and program administration. So these 5310 projects, these traditional 5310 projects are intended to be projects that are designed to meet the specific needs of seniors and individuals with disabilities. In other words, not necessarily public transportation, because these services can be very specially designed for these specific types of travelers. And then on the other hand, that other 45% of projects, the other 5310 projects, have a slightly different intent. I won't go too deeply into the history, but the reason why we split it up this way is because in 2012, a previous authorization bill repealed a former FTA program called the New Freedom Program, and it rolled that program into the existing Section 5310 program. So that previous program was intended to fund these types that are listed here, projects, public transportation projects that exceed the minimum Americans with Disability Act's requirements, or alternatives that assist seniors and individuals with accessing public transportation, or in general, improving the accessibility of existing fixed route transit. So when these programs were combined, the Section 5310 program, that's when it started to have these two different tracks. So staying in this idea of two different types of 5310 projects, there are different eligible subrecipients in a way under traditional and other 5310 projects. Under traditional 5310, the primary subrecipient type is the private nonprofit organization that provides aging or disability transportation. And then in the case that the state has certified that there are no nonprofit organizations, or if the state or designated recipient has certified that there are no nonprofit organizations in that area, then a state, local, or tribal governmental authority can step in and operate that specialized service. On the other hand, with these other Section 5310 projects, there's more immediate flexibility in the type of organization that can be a subrecipient. So it can be a state, local, or tribal authority, or it can be, again, a nonprofit organization, or it can be an operator of public transportation. To focus more on these traditional 5310 projects, it's important to note that these are only intended to be capital purchases. So that can be vehicles of any kind, vehicle rehabilitation and maintenance, vehicle equipment, including lifts, ramps, and securement devices, other equipment purchases, mobility management, which FTA defines as a capital expense, but can include all sorts of activities that enhance coordination of mobility and transportation services, and the cost of leased or contracted services, which again could include in those contracts, it could include what you might think of as an operating expense, but the cost of that the cost of contracting it and the contract itself we'll consider it to be a capital expense under the Section 5310 program, or especially under traditional Section 5310 projects. Under eligible other Section 5310 projects, you'll note that mobility management is an eligible expense again here, as is travel training, curb cuts and other infrastructure investments that make transit more accessible, mileage reimbursement for volunteer driver programs. Operating expenses are eligible under this other 5310 project, including administration and operation of transportation brokerages, operation of one-call, one-click call centers, and funding voucher programs. So to call back to that, the intent of these projects, you can see how, for instance, running a travel training program or making fixed route transit more accessible through infrastructure investments, that's the kind of thing that makes existing public transportation more accessible to seniors and individuals with disabilities. So I'll go over our local match requirements under Section 5310 briefly, and then I'll return to this in a different section of my presentation. But at a high level, capital expenses need to have at least a 20% local match of the total project cost. Operating expenses need to have at least a 50% local match, with two exceptions. Vehicles that comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Clean Air Act only require at least a 15% local share. And then with facilities of that similar intent, they only require at least a 10% local share. I'll note once, and I'll reiterate this again, these are the FTA requirements for local match. And we give designated recipients that administer these programs at the state and local level to further refine what those requirements are, and also contribute state and local funding often so that subrecipients don't necessarily have to come up with the entire local share on their own. And I'll also note that they have the discretion to make these requirements more restrictive, so, but not less restrictive than what FTA sets out. Moving into our second learning objective, how to access 5310s at the state or local level. I'll go into some advice on how to identify that in your area. So before I do that, I will offer more background on how FTA distributes Section 5310 funding. So every year upon congressional appropriation, I mentioned we split it up, that 60-20-20 split between large urban, small urban, and rural. So in small urban and rural areas, the state is the designated recipient. And so that is your State Department of Transportation. And it's oftentimes also the Section 5311 rural area designated recipient for the state. In large urban areas, that diverges. So the governor needs to designate a recipient that is well-positioned and well-positioned to provide and coordinate transportation services for that region, that large urban area, or multiple large urban areas that are in proximity with one another and make up a larger region. Oftentimes, that's also the urbanized area formula, Section 5307 designated recipient, and that's another FTA grant program. And often it's a metropolitan planning organization or a council of governments, but not always. It could also be a transit service operator in that region. I'll overview some of, again, the FTA program requirements that we place on direct 5310 designated recipients. And then I'll go into why that matters for a subrecipient and what those implications are. So one of the most important requirements is that each of these designated recipients need to have either a state management plan or program management plan. They also need to plan for future transportation needs and facilitate a process that strongly emphasizes coordination across many transit providers. In their management of the 5310 funds, they have to develop and publish project selection criteria for subrecipients and demonstrate that that process is fair. They need to notify the local entities or potential subrecipients of the availability of this funding and receive and review applications. And then from there, submit to FTA an annual program of the planned projects that they will fund with that Section 5310 funding. And it's their responsibility to make sure that those subrecipients execute grant agreements with that designated recipient that complies with the federal requirements, including some of the ones I've described today, the eligible project types and the local match, but also other broader cross-cutting federal requirements that have to do with, for instance, like the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 has a lot of requirements about making employers and public programs accessible and non-discriminatory. And so that's a cross-cutting federal requirement that a designated recipient would also need to make sure all of their subrecipients are in compliance with. And then this last requirement is that all projects that are funded through 5310 need to be included in a locally developed, coordinated public transit human service transportation plan. And so the reason I bolded two of those things is because I think they're two of the requirements that are have the most implications for a subrecipient. So as a subrecipient, you very much need to be familiar. Not only do you need to identify who your designated recipient is, but be very familiar with their management plan, because that's where they set forth their project selection process. And then secondly, you very much want to be involved in the development of your region's coordinated public transit human service transportation plan. Because like I said, you need to have been involved in that process to have communicated your needs and priorities and for them to be reflected in the plan so that the projects that you propose to be funded will be eligible and reflected in that plan to begin with. So I'll take a moment to go through an example. I'll use South Carolina DOT as an example of, once you've figured out who your designated recipient is, how to look through their website and get a sense, look for the key points of their state management plan. And in general, to back up for a second, how do you figure out who your designated recipient is? If you're in a small urban or rural area, it's your State Department of Transportation. And you could Google, for instance, South Carolina Department of Transportation, Section 5310 Transit. And you would likely find their homepage for that program. If you're in a large urbanized area, I recommend you Google search the name of that urbanized area. You might have to use a Census Bureau map or list of urbanized areas to first identify whether or not you are in that urbanized area. So Google the name of that urbanized area plus the words FTA 5310, and you're very likely to find the name of a metropolitan planning organization or a council of governments or some other governmental authority that is that designated 5310 program, and a public website that summarizes their funding process. So going into South Carolina DOT as an example, say you've Googled them and this is their public transit page. And what you're specifically, for them, the way that what you would specifically find on that page is this section called the Transit Subrecipient Portal. And when you see the word state management plan, that is definitely one of the first things you want to look at. And so I opened it up and I pulled a couple sections that you would flag for yourself and read carefully. One of those flags is the section where they would describe the funding criteria. So like what kinds of projects are they looking for on an annual basis? Another really important section is what is this application review and approval schedule? So here, I highlighted the word January. In their state management plan, they're stating that every January is when they receive all 5310 proposals. So then you must know that every January is around the time that you need to have been prepared to, well before January really, to have submitted a proposal for funding. And then they also have a section on the coordination plan development. If you read this, you can see that they have 10 councils of government in South Carolina, and the state tasks those COGs to facilitate that plan in a region. And so not only would you have to be working with the DOT, you would also have wanted to connected with the relevant COG in your region to have been involved in that planning process. So I'll move into, and I guess the last thing I'll say is for your area or your region, if you can't figure out who your designated recipient is, you should certainly reach out to your Wright FTA regional office, of which there are 10, and they can help you identify who that designated recipient is. So for learning objective 3, in this section on local match and cost sharing, I want to offer the federal perspective on what's eligible again in more detail, but with special emphasis on how other federal funds can be part of that cost sharing strategy. And then again, these are high level because you certainly need to make sure with your designated recipient that what you specifically want to use as local match, if that's asked of you, is eligible under their administration of the program. So review, these are the local match requirements as defined by FTA. And again, defined by FTA, these are some of the potential local match sources that are eligible under 5310. So that could be income from contracts. If a subrecipient is paying for a contract to provide human service transportation, the revenue from that could be used as local match for a different 5310 project by that subrecipient, or it could be used to reduce the operating expenses and therefore the total project cost, which would, by extension, reduce the local match requirement. We've also made toll and transportation development credits an eligible local match, and other non-cash sources like donations of vehicles, volunteer services, or other in-kind contributions, as well as all non-Department of Transportation, but federal funding sources, as long as they have expressly allowed in their program statute or guidance that those funds can be used as match to other federal programs. And of course that they're paying for, those funds from that other federal program are used to pay for eligible transportation expense. So instead of going deeply into some examples, because it does depend so much on your state or designated recipient, not so much, but it does depend. What I'll do, I guess, is give you a homework assignment, which is that earlier this year, there was a really fantastic research report published by the National Cooperative Highway Research Program. And FTA contributed to the development of this report and the research behind it. And so they researched a whole host of different in-kind match sources and local match sources as reported by state DOTs that are eligible in those states, and identified a lot of unique, creative, and innovative ways that FTA's local match requirements have been met in those states. So some examples of in-kind match that are eligible were the use of land and facilities, staff and volunteer time, advertising, costs spent on advertising for transportation services, insurance for a transportation program, licensing of vehicles, or the expenses on vehicles themselves or vehicle maintenance. So I've linked that final report here. And it also comes along with a guidebook of case studies that go even more in depth in how specific entities have met in-kind match requirements. I'll also take a second I said that FTA expressly allows other federal funding to be used as local match. This is exactly where in our Section 5310 program guidance that we state that. And we even say that we even give examples of programs that could be potential sources, employment related federal funding programs, training and job force programs, aging, medical, community services, rehabilitation, and nutrition services, federal programs. And in general, the link I've provided here to our Section 5310 program guidance would be a fantastic source to understand a lot of the other program requirements that I've described today. And I'll also put in that another thing that happened really recently is we've always stated that that HHS Older American Act funds were an eligible match source for our programs as a really good example and a common example. But we also further clarified in collaboration with HHS's Office of General Counsel that any HHS funds that can be used for transportation can be used as local match for FTA's 5310 and 5311 programs. So Mary Lazare, the head of the administration for community living at the time of the summit that this was announced that herself. And we have a recording of that on our website, and we've referenced that and done the best that we can to make sure that that is public knowledge. So I've included a link to that webcast and where she's stated that. And we've also put that out in our email listservs and mentioned that anytime that we can. Because there's so many HHS programs that would be an excellent source of additional transportation funding. So I'll go back to that homework assignment and that research report I mentioned on allowable in-kind and local match sources, and say that some of the other federal match sources that they reported or that they found in their survey of state DOTs was beyond the Department of Education Centers for Independent Living funding source, HHS's Programs for American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaii Elders, which I think is under ACL, HHS's Developmental Disabilities Grants, Department of Labor's Senior Community Service Employment Program, and the VA's Veterans Transportation and Community Living Initiative. So again, this is some examples of federal programs that we know have been used as the local match on FTA grants in recent history. And I'll also, in the next module, I'll also point you to other resources we've developed that have tried to create even more of a comprehensive list of potential federal programs that can be used as local match for an FTA grant. I guess that's a good segue. So our last learning objective is I'll overview some of these federal coordination initiatives that I keep alluding to. And that have been expressly designed to encourage and foster coordination of transportation at the local level. The first one I'll talk about, or the one that I'll mainly talk about, is the Coordinated Council on Access and Mobility, or CCAM. So this is an interagency partnership that was first created in 2004 by an executive order by the president to really to open the door for federal agencies that don't normally coordinate with each other to make sure that their transportation funding programs are coordinated in a way that so that local transportation providers that provide transportation to people with disabilities, older adults, and people of low income face fewer barriers to seamless access to transportation and mobility services. And since the implementation in 2004, the activities of the CCAM have really only accelerated. And for instance, in 2006, the FAST Act, that last reauthorization bill, directed the CCAM to publish a strategic plan that outlines how CCAM will continue the work that they're doing and provide policy recommendations to Congress and the President, and further eliminate various regulatory and statutory barriers to coordinated transportation service. So that HHS announcement that I mentioned earlier is a really good example of the kind of conversation that has taken place between federal agencies as a result of the coordination that CCAM has fostered. And I'll read out the list of the 11 federal member agencies that are part of CCAM. It's chaired by the Secretary of Transportation, and its members include cabinet level appointees from the Secretaries of Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Labor, Department of Education, Department of Interior, Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Agriculture, Veterans Affairs, the Attorney General, the Commissioner of the Social Security Administration, and the Chairperson of the National Council on Disability. So you can really get a sense of how diverse the perspectives are on this council and how diverse the funding opportunities and programs are that are represented here. Two of the CCAM resources that have been developed that I think are most relevant for this, the audience of this module would be a very recently published federal fund grading guide, which gives you the tools and the ability to navigate different federal funding programs, statutes, and guidance to understand whether or not you could combine those different federal programs to coordinate transportation with funding from both. So it tells you like where you should be looking in the statute for a specific program, where you should be looking in the program requirements, and what kind of language you should be looking for that you could use to confirm whether or not that's a federally eligible combination of funds. Another thing that was published by the CCAM was this program inventory, which identified 122 federal programs that can be used to fund human service transportation. And so that, you know, I gave you that example, I think of 5 different programs. We know of at least 122 that could potentially be eligible. And so these two resources go together in that the program inventory gives you like the broader list or a long list of possible programs. And then you need to use that, you would want to refer to that federal fund grading guide to do more research on whether or not you really could combine funds from these different programs. The next resource and like initiative that I'll overview is the various technical assistance centers that my office in FTA, Rural and Targeted Programs Division, sponsors. So you're certainly familiar by this point with the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center, NADTC, but we also sponsor the National Center for Mobility Management, the Rural Transit Assistance Program, and the National Center for Applied Transit Technology. And each of these are really dedicated to providing, to identifying best practices, fostering knowledge sharing, doing practice-oriented research and identifying the state of practice, and also advancing the state of practice. And so the folks that run these centers are super passionate and love to be reached out to directly and to work closely with transit providers and transportation providers to identify solutions to their challenges that, that meet their needs and are informed by what other folks around the country are doing. So I strongly encourage you to follow some of these links and learn more about one or more of these centers that sounds relevant to you. And since I'm going to assume that you've already familiarized yourself with NADTC, I'll also highlight the National Center for Mobility Management, which is specifically designed to provide technical assistance in the development and implementation of transportation coordination, one call, one click, and mobility management practices. And something I think that's really great that they do is they have designated a liaison for every FTA region, because these mobility management practices are so regionally and regionally context specific. They're having a liaison in every region makes it easier for them to connect you with resources that are most relevant to where you are situated. So I definitely encourage you to follow this link and connect with your liaison if you haven't already, and if you're interested in getting more connected with the resources and the networks that they maintain. I'll also put in a plug for the National Transit Institute, which is another resource that FTA sponsors through cooperative agreement. They provide training and education. Their mission is to provide training and education to the public transportation industry at large. And they do that through both like webinars that you can sign up for and listen to from your home, as well as multi-day in-person courses that we often ask them to plan in concurrence with major industry conferences. So if you're already traveling to a conference, you should definitely look into whether or not NTI will be there and whether or not they've planned a course to take place in the days preceding, during, or after that conference. And it's definitely relevant to this audience in that several of the courses that we've worked with NTI to develop cover mobility management. One of our courses is called Growing Your Ridership by Welcoming Older Riders. And they also have a number of courses on understanding ADA requirements for public transportation operators. And most importantly, this NTI courses have free registration for government and transportation agency employees. So it's something that we want to make as accessible as possible. And then the last couple resources I'll share have to do with resources through FTA directly. So FTA has 10 different regional offices, and in these offices, they work with local transit officials. Within FTA, these are the offices where FTA staff are working most closely with local transit officials, especially to make sure that the funding agreements that these local transit officials and their agencies enter into are meeting federal requirements. But they also can serve as another resource. Like I mentioned, if you need to figure out who your designated recipient is, they can help you make that connection as well. And then to get in touch with our FTA Office of Program Management, I would recommend you to get in touch with, if it's whoever the 5310 program manager is, if you have a question about the program at a national level, a national funding level, understanding the FTA program requirements more specifically. And the reason I don't put my contact information up is because you want to know who the 5310 program manager is at whatever point in time you're listening to this recording, not just right now. And so you'll want to reach out to the Office of Program Management to find out who that person is, if it isn't me. And our contact information is here, and we're available during all business hours. So with that, I really appreciate the opportunity to overview FTA's Section 5310 program and just more generally the variety of resources that we've been involved in developing to help ensure that our recipients or subrecipients of our funding have the ability and the resources to implement transportation services that meet their community's needs. So thank you very much.
Wow, Amy, thank you so much.
Back to you, Eileen.
So I just want to have a couple comments at the end. One thing I heard you say that I'd like to repeat for folks is that there's a great deal of flexibility and creativity that I heard you talk about and how these funds can be applied to your community. I'm not sure everyone realizes that in terms of mobility management, travel training, the infrastructure investments, and also your great highlight on the variety of in-kind match sources and also federal matching sources. So I definitely wanted to repeat that. And also, I do want to quickly underscore the necessary requirement in eligibility to become involved in the development of your region's coordinated transportation plan, because that's an emphasis of coordination that in this course we're really highlighting. It becomes hugely valuable in creating successful programs. So I just want to make sure to reiterate that. One thing that I would encourage participants to do in our forum, if they receive 5310 funding or funding from another federal program, is to talk about the structure of the program that they've received money for, how they went about that process. I think one of the things that this section of the course specifically can help us learn is the different ways to apply these dollars in creating successful programs. And Amy, I'm sure you and your team are always looking to hear about the results of programs, and you would encourage this type of knowledge sharing among organizations. So we will provide some additional materials for downloads on the course platform to supplement everything that Amy talked about in this presentation. We'll pull out some of these important links that she referenced. So make sure to check those out. Amy, thank you again for this really great presentation. It's full of such valuable information, and we really appreciate your time.
Certainly, my pleasure. And I completely agree with all of the key takeaways that you just summarized.
Great, thank you so much.